It's a great pleasure to be here today and seeing so many friends and to be in Israel. What I'm going to try to do is share some thoughts that are based on my involvement in this process, and in particular in my role as chair of the EU seminar that was held in Brussels and in which some of you participated last July. The seminar was titled A Seminar to Promote Confidence Building and in Support of a Process Aimed at Establishing a Zone Free of WMD and Means of Delivery in the Middle East. I think this title tells a lot of how far we are from a WMD-free zone in a way. Nevertheless, it was interesting because we had a good participation, including the involvement of all the countries in the region. I wouldn't necessarily say the constructive involvement of all the countries in the region, but at least the involvement of all of them, including Iran and Syria and Israel, of course, in that EU workshop, which was, for that, I think, led to some interesting discussions. I will not provide you with a summary of the debate because this is available on the website of this EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, which is just nonproliferation.eu, and the summary that I wrote to conclude that is fully available, so I won't read it to you. But what I will try to do is share some more personal views on where we are and looking at the relevance of the project, the constraints ahead of us, and some thoughts on the way forward as we see it. On the relevance, I mean, the first thing to say is that somehow it's tempting to say it's very irrelevant. The issue has been on the table for 35 years. Not much progress has been achieved. You know, the first draft of a nuclear weapon-free zone at the time was tabled by Iran in 1974, and ever since, especially the Egyptian diplomacy has been pushing for this very strongly. But what we can see is not much progress. So in a way, compared to other nuclear weapon-free zones, it is probably the one that has achieved the less progress in the last 35 years. In spite of moments of interesting moments, of course, the 95 NPT conference, sort of, which tabled the concept of a WMD-free zone, was an important turning point, and the 2010 NPT conference gave a new impetus to all of this by setting a target date for an international conference, 2012, that would be dedicated to this particular issue. And having said all of this, the likelihood remains very low, as the conditions are absolutely not met yet for establishing such a zone. Does it, therefore, the idea of a Middle East weapon of mass destruction-free zone remains a very long-term prospect, and this is, I think, something we have to bear in mind when discussing it. I think it could even fall into the category of not in my lifetime project, as a global zero nuclear weapon. And here I'm just quoting President Obama when he was mentioning this prospect in his famous Prague speech. So, having said all of this, why is it nevertheless interesting to discuss this and maybe to start some serious negotiation about all of this? I would say that first of all, here in Israel you might consider this is none of your business, but this has become part of the global non-proliferation regime bargain, and this is something that the countries that are party to the NPT do value somehow. For that, there is a commitment of the whole NPT community to move forward on this particular issue. And this has been, let's be very honest on this, a very big success of the Egyptian diplomacy in the last 17 years to manage to put this very much at the center of some of the NPT debates. Some of us, including myself, might think that there are more important issues to be tackled to save the regime, but nevertheless, it has become a very important part of that general bargain since 95, so that can't be completely overruled. And if we want to achieve progress on other issues such as non-proliferation, disarmament, civilian nuclear cooperation, this is part of the scenery, and as such, it is important. The second thing I would suggest is that it is also a tool to address some of the major security challenges associated with WMD and missile proliferation in the Middle East. And as such, it has a value in itself, not only for the regime, and this is something I think we should really seriously look at. Having said this, I would suggest, nevertheless, that there are very, very important stumbling blocks on the road to the 2012 conference and to a zone, even as a long-term prospect. As we come closer to the event, we have to really look at some of the very much unresolved issues. To quote, to misquote Clemenceau, I would say that there are three priorities that are there and that are not resolved, which are security, security, and security. In a way, one of the issues about the Middle East WMD-Free zone is to try to address some of the security concerns of the country in the region. And so far, those security concerns are not being addressed. And here I'm not talking only about Israel. I'm talking about all the countries in the region, which, for many of them, feel that their security concerns are currently not being addressed. And this is probably the main driver behind this zone, which makes this zone far more difficult to achieve than the African one, the Latin American one, or the South Pacific one. And it's quite telling, as Sidhu was hinting at, to say that the region where there is proliferation underway, where there are arms races underway, are the regions where such zones don't exist. This was long the case for Europe, where any plans to establish such a zone have collapsed over the years. It was the case for South Asia. And in a way, the difficulties faced even with those Southeast Asian zone are telling for that purpose. And as part of that security landscape, I don't have to go into details. This is what we've been debating in the last. We'll be debating all day. In fact, proliferation is there in the region. It's taking place, and the news since '95 are not good ones. I think if we look at it seriously, there are very few good news. Of course, one can say that the Libyan and Iraqi cases have been resolved more or less in terms of proliferation, at least. But we have the Iranian nuclear program that is there on the table. We have also a tremendous trend towards missile proliferation that shouldn't be overlooked, and this is part of the equation, including with access of non-state actors to such technologies. We have the ongoing programs on in terms of chemical and biological weapons in several countries in the region. And we have to bear in mind that this is one answer to one of Efren's point about whether we should cover all WMD or not. We are in the only region where chemical weapons have been used. So that is, I think it's one reason not to leave these issues aside. And obviously, when it comes to an Arab perspective, they haven't seen much good news on the front of the discussions with Israel when it comes to arms control. The ACUS process is stalled, and the issue is they don't have a feeling that they have any grip on neither the Israeli nuclear program or in serious discussion when it comes to dealing with security. So somehow we are in a situation that is worse than when the, let's say, current cycle started in '95, and this is making things extraordinarily difficult when looking at that. A second stumbling block is that they are very, very different, and this was very clear during the Brussels conference, expectations and priorities. Israelis emphasized the fact that there are some security conditions that are to be met before looking into the prospect of such a zone, when others tend to consider that the zone is a starting point of a process, and that's one cross expectation that is very complicated to manage. A second one is that obviously for many key players, the zone is in fact about Israel joining the NPT, and if Israel was to join the NPT, maybe their interest in the zone would diminish very quickly. And they would see their goal achieved by such a development. So that makes things complicated as well. And lastly, there are very few small steps to be taken. I will name a few of them, but it's as we see it, the last holdouts when it comes to the CWC are there, and we don't expect them to move very quickly. When there had been some progress in a time. When it comes to the NPT, I mean, Israel is the only country not having signed the treaty. We were just saying how far we were from a negotiated settlement for Iran, which will be obviously very much part of this global picture. So we are in a very, very complicated setting. And that leads to positions by key players that are very much full of preconditions. And this is making things all the more complicated because everyone is coming with a list of preconditions that is very, very long, making even the fact of holding the conference extremely difficult for that, and making the likelihood of a successful conference even more difficult. Part of that is also the fact that many countries in the region, including Israel, tend to retain all the bargaining chips that they might have in terms of signing or ratifying treaties in their sleeves for whenever the moment comes. And I'm not sure, maybe Shimon will comment on this, but there are obviously some of them that are not that great of bargaining chips and could be given away as a sort of a confidence measure. But nevertheless, the tendency everywhere is to do that, and including on issues that are not so relevant from a security perspective. I will name one example that I cherish very much. We conducted a large project on this in the last couple of years, which is the Hague Code of Conduct on Missiles. In theory, every country in the region could be part of this. This is absolutely, I mean, it's not legally binding, it's easy. It's basically a pure confidence-building measure about putting down a three-page report on your missile-related activities and notifying tests without any constraints on the programs themselves, without any on-site inspection, without anything that could be perceived as a security constraint. In the region, only Jordan subscribed to that code, which tells a lot about the perception about that and about the appetite for even very, very degraded confidence-building measures that would be fully compatible even with a large-scale testing program like the Iranians have, because, as you know, when you test a missile, you still have to notify it somehow for airspace problems and things like that. So we're very much there. So what would be, having given this very gloomy picture, what would be the way forward? And there I want to end on a rather more optimistic note, picking some of the conclusions of the Brussels event in terms of ideas for moving forward. I think somehow it is good that there is a wide acknowledgement of the fact that it is difficult, because it means that the expectations might be a little lower than than we might have thought even in 2010. When you discuss in private or in public, even in public with many of the key players, at least those that are genuinely engaged, I'm thinking about the Egyptians and others, they recognize that it's not going to be an easy path, and they don't expect from the 2012 conference a draft treaty or anything like this. What they probably expect are steps forward in that direction, the sort of recognition that it is a goal that is shared by everyone. But I think it is important to say. And I would say that somehow, because this is so difficult, because this is so demanding, because we don't know where we're heading, it's worthwhile starting now, because otherwise you keep sort of pushing it away, and it has some value for the rest of the thing. The second point is coming back to the issue of security. I think the idea is developing that the issue of security is important. I mean, it was in not only my conclusion, but in the general conclusions of the Brussels meeting, that the security dimension of this debate could not be overlooked. And it was not a purely, let's say, pleasant diplomatic debate about having a joint statement, but that there were serious security issues to be addressed, and I think this is part of this issue. And this goes beyond regional security, because obviously, I mean, it has international security implications. Thirdly, I think the issue of nuclear weapons is obviously perceived as a top priority for many players. Nevertheless, I think there is a recognition that it goes beyond that, and that you can't address them separately from the rest, which is, I would assume, a good news from an Israeli perspective, because it sort of diffused a little bit the pressure from only the Israeli nuclear capability to expand it to the management of other issues such as biological weapons, chemical weapons, and missiles that are there. Looking at it, somehow one recommendation is really to take a very much incremental approach. And we should probably not be saying this is what we want to achieve and this is what it will look like by a sort of general principle statement of saying the draft treaty exists and now it's a matter of negotiating it for X number of years. I think somehow there are plenty of steps, and I think it's it was one of the very interesting outcome of the Brussels meeting, is that there are plenty of things that could lead towards this notion of a WMD-free zone that are not a free zone treaty per se, or that are not only about joining the various conventions. There are plenty of very useful steps that could be taken. Some of them relate around confidence-building measures, voluntary or negotiated, bilateral, multilateral. Some of them revolve about accession to existing agreements, short of the most difficult ones. So I think all these steps, some of them, amongst all these steps, some of them can be achieved in a very reasonable time frame, and that's important. Another point is, I think, the issue of the negotiation framework, which has not been agreed yet, in spite of the appointment of a Finnish facilitator, is interesting. Because it's still open. And I think it's important because I don't see any reason why Israel should be part of an NPT process without being a member of the NPT. This is quite obvious. It's quite clear that a formal UN process would be complicated to manage for many reasons. And I've perceived some openness on the variety of options when it comes to that. And I think there is some flexibility, including on the part of some of the tough players on this particular issue, that the general arrangements and in preparing the EU event, it was quite clear that many of the players demonstrated some flexibility on this, and I think it's important. I think there should be probably fairly intense preparation, and that should not take the play. That should not be big events. I think if we want to achieve some progress, some smaller groups could meet and look at some of the issues and by involving some of the most constructive players. I'm not sure I want Ambassador Soltania in the room all the time, to be honest, because that's making debates a bit difficult. My point on this is to say that I think that some of these issues can be tackled and some of the complicated issues can be diffused somehow by smaller groups meetings, and more discrete meetings as well. A couple of last points. I think that there are several approaches that can be mutually reinforcing rather than mutually exclusive. You can have bilateral, you can have unilateral steps, you can have bilateral discussions, you can have plurilateral discussions involving several countries, you can have full regional discussions, and you can have international involvement. I think all of these have their value, and we shouldn't focus on the fact that it has to be inclusive with all the countries in the region, or that it has to be very narrowed down to a purely, Israeli, Egyptian bilateral discussion. I think there is some value in using the variety of formats into that negotiation process. So, and I must say from the Brussels meeting that there is some value in having track 2, track 1.5 meetings, because that allows some fresh thinking on these issues that would be far more complicated in a formal setting. So that's important to bear that in mind as well. And there are plenty of activities. I know Shimon was in Como, where our Italian colleagues have been looking at some of the technicalities. We're discussing it today. There is a meeting in Amman soon. So I think it's there. So to wrap up in a sentence, if you allow, I would say that we shouldn't be saying that this is irrelevant or absurd, but we shouldn't underestimate the fact that it's extremely difficult. And I think there is some view, there are some benefits from everyone to have the process rolling, bearing in mind that we're talking about a very, very long-term perspective, and that there are some benefits in the interim period of achieving things, and not only to allow Western diplomacies to be more at ease in the next NPT conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Camille.